You all set?
Yep.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today for today's event, Tax Policy Toward Arts Nonprofits, Democracy or Plutocracy. My name is George Mitchell. I'm a professor here and the director of the Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management at the Marxe School here at Baruch in the community system. And just give you a quick kind of run-up show of what to expect here in the next 90 minutes. I'll shortly be introducing Phil, and he'll provide remarks for about 40 minutes or so. And then I'll take the host's prerogative to pose a few questions to get the Q&A going. And we'll reserve, hopefully, at least to the last 30 minutes or so toward the end of the 90 minutes for just audience Q&A. Phil's also very, very knowledgeable about tax policy and federal policies affecting nonprofits more broadly, beyond just the arts context. So we'll invite those questions at that time as well. We do have a number of people joining us online as well as in person. If you're in person, please help yourself to some coffee over to the side. And if you are online, we also invite your questions and comments there as well. And we'll be looking at that during the Q&A period to pose some of those comments and questions to our speaker today. All right, well, with all that being said, let me introduce our speaker today. Phil Hackney is a professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He writes and speaks about U.S. tax law and nonprofits, and is often quoted in news outlets such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he often appears as well on TV, including CNN and CBS. His scholarship considers how principles of democracy intersect with tax policy and nonprofits, and he's testified about tax policy in front of the U.S. Senate as well as House committees. Before becoming a professor, he worked as an attorney in the office of the Chief Counsel of the IRS in Washington, D.C., in its exempt organizations group for 5 years. In IRS speak, that means basically the nonprofit division of the IRS, such as it is. Drafting IRS regulations, writing briefs, and advising the IRS commissioner regarding tax-exempt law. Professor Hackney's wife, Jill, is a professional artist who paints in oil. They are both actively involved in arts nonprofits. So without any further ado, I'll turn things over to Phil to please take it away.
All right. And how do I fast forward? How do I push forward?
We get you presented.
Okay, thanks. All right, so thank you all. Thank you online, and thank you guys here in the community. So I'm going to talk to you today about U.S. tax policy and kind of its art policy through that tax law. So I'm a tax law professor, University of Pittsburgh, and I focus on nonprofit tax law and critique it from a political justice perspective. There's some technical stuff we'll discuss today, but I try to keep it pretty minimal. And I think it's totally doable. So I think a lot of this stuff is stuff that folks kind of implicitly know, particularly if you're in the nonprofit space. But hang with me. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. So this is going to be a discussion about nonprofit organizations that further the arts and what the tax law does to subsidize those organizations to make more of them viable. Are those subsidies through tax exemption? Thank you. And particularly the charitable contribution deduction. Justifiable. We're going to be talking, this is symphonies, art museums, performing arts centers, theaters, art foundations, a wide range, any kind of group that's doing art. I'm focused on the observance of art rather than education about art. So I'm more interested in the idea of what it means to observe art and the justification for those, as I think education about art has its own reason for being. So this is a work in progress, so I appreciate comments and feedback. And there are things you guys might know, literature and so on, that I really appreciate. I work in the legal space. I like to work a lot in other spaces, but I don't know that stuff quite as well, philosophy and history and so on. So I appreciate your comments. So, I'll note this is Brancusi's Bird in Space. I think this one is at the Guggenheim. I'm not positive about that. The reason I'm using that one is it's one of our earliest efforts by a court to define what is art. There was a tariff when Constantine Brancusi sent this over in 1926 on metal objects of 40%, and I think it was like 5% if you were sending over art. Somebody over here got word that Constantine Brancusi was going to be sending it over, and they really didn't like modern art, and so they gave a heads up to the tariff inspectors here in New York that this thing was coming in, and it's not really, and they charged 40% tax on this thing because they said it was just a metal object rather than art. And so the court had to deal with what is art, and it was kind of the first time that they moved towards a definition of not just representational, but aesthetically pleasing. And this is important kind of for the paper. In both the notion of we have to define art, but also what is art. Is it just aesthetically pleasing? Is it just taste? So, this is kind of a brief aside, but it's directly related to the paper at the same time. This is my wife's work. She's a painter. This is the swamp in Louisiana near Lake Martin. So, long ago, I'm 55 now, my first child, Ben, was born. He's 27 now, and he was about 6 months old, so just a baby. And my wife is behind me, and I'm holding Ben, and I'm looking at him, and I'm trying to think about all the things he could be. And this pops out, if it goes forward. Let's see, will it do it? Yeah, there we go. Are you going to be an artist or a thinking person? And that's where it stopped. I mean, it literally stopped there. And my wife, she was offended that I classified the world into people who think and people who are artists. And she's never forgotten that moment. And I have paid for it many times over. I've tried to explain, well, I was trying to say all sorts of different things, but it's still kind of stuck. And I mean, what I've come to understand is I had a real conception in my brain, actually literally separating those things apart. And I think in Western society, we often do that. We often think of things into the aesthetically pleasing, and we code those into non-thinking, probably gender those things as well as I think about it. So this paper is kind of a response to that in its own way. I can now tell my wife that not only is an artist a thinking person, but what an artist does, I think, is the very foundation of our social structure, both as to its rationality and to its potential to connect with one another, to see through another's eyes, which I think is really critical to what art is. And I'll talk a bit about that today. And it's also a merging of our two careers. We've long been based in arts nonprofits. They kind of mean the world to us. Jill's involved with a lot of arts organizations down in Louisiana in particular. This is our friend George Marxe. He's a painter as well, but he started in a group called New News Arts and Culture Collective in Arnaudville, Louisiana, not too far from the swamp that my wife painted. And George is brilliant, and he's developed a relationship between the French government and Louisiana and kind of the whole Francophone diaspora. And he thinks of this group that he started up called New News Arts and Culture Collective as his own social sculpting, in a way, in terms of running this arts organization. It's connected us to the world, but also really locally in Louisiana in very important ways. It's kind of funny. It makes me emotional thinking about it. So it's amazing that art can do that in very deep ways. So George has been very fundamental to us, and it really relates deeply to how I'm thinking about these arts organizations. I'll talk about this too just briefly. I'm connecting in my Pittsburgh world as well. This is a mosaic found in Perryopolis Pennsylvania. So Perryopolis is about 40 miles down the Youghiogheny River from Pittsburgh. It was a former coal mining center, and this woman, Rachel Sager, bought an abandoned coal mine. She just bought a house that was kind of the mining center, but it turned out she had bought the whole mine without being aware of it. And this was her family history, and she was also a mosaic artist. And so she started up a thing called Sager Mosaics there, on the banks of the Youghiogheny in the middle of nowhere in a certain sense. But she has artists come from around the world that tell the story of this abandoned coal mine there. It had Hungarian coal miners, and it had black coal miners that came up kind of escaping the South. And this is a mosaic of one of the black coal miners that worked there at Sager Mosaics. And again, like I have this here because to me, art has this really fundamental way of telling our history and relating ourselves to one another in very deep ways. So, this is, of course, Andy Warhol, the soup cans. And again, this is a Pittsburgh-based thing as well. We've got the Warhol here in New York, but, Andy Warholia grew up in Pittsburgh in communities. And I even know his nephew in terms of that community. But significantly to the way I'm thinking about art, Immanuel Kant, philosopher, German, grew up in part of the Soviet Union as well, East Germany, had one of his antinomies. And really quick, what is an antinomy? An antinomy is, at least from my perspective, it is two statements that are absolutely true, but they're contradictory. So kind of a paradox. And Kant built a lot of his philosophy off of these antinomies, these things that are both true but contradictory at the same time. And it sits at the heart of this paper. When I write a paper, I like to think about two ideas that really clash, but that you both believe in. And so that is, art is a matter of taste and a matter of judgment, right? Art feels like a purely subjective matter, and we think of it in that way, but it is also something that we treat as something that we can argue about. We literally argue about art on a regular basis, and the only way we can do that is by the fact that it is bringing in rationality. We're having arguments about this thing in a rational kind of way. We have these judgments. So it's both taste, just this very personal preference kind of thing, but also a matter of judgment. And it's both of those things at the same time. And that creates real challenges regarding how to think about what function it plays for us in society. And that antinomy is kind of at the heart of the paper in terms of whether the state should support arts or not, and how it would go about doing that. You can't resolve this antinomy. The entire policy debate really is just different social ways of trying to solve it or live with it. It's at the heart of my argument, and it shows some things. It shows why current tax policy critiques don't really discuss the things we need to discuss to resolve policy challenges that we face, in terms of whether the state should support art and whether the state should support art in this particular way by using our income tax to accomplish that result. Tax policy folk, let's see, do I want to move forward? No, not just yet. I'll also talk here, I think, a little bit about what my definition of art is, and that relates back to each of these slides I've shown regarding art. Though we started with a definition which was aesthetic or representational, I'm most at home, and it feels most central to the paper to think of art in its institutional definition that someone like Danto uses, which is that we cannot have a definition of art without a theory about it. We have to resort to theory because black paint is just black paint without some theory about what that paint is doing and some conception, some rationality about that thing. So it's, to a certain extent, what an artist says it is, but also the culture around it that determines that this thing is indeed art. And of course, Andy Warhol's paintings really lay bare that kind of question. It's both an advertisement for Campbell's soup. It was the literal replication of that thing. His Brillo pad is kind of the same thing, but it's also a cultural matter, and we cannot talk about this without having someone both identifying this thing as art, the artist, but also a cultural group that has that conversation about it. So tax policy folk within the legal sphere, and to a certain extent economics, because that's the main folks I know who talk about tax policy, have long eschewed discussing political justice and instead focus kind of on an economic critique primarily. They tend to stay away from these things, and I've been trying to push for bringing the notion of political justice of some sort. And for me, political justice is about democracy and deciding things together, having a collective mechanism for accomplishing that. Dealing with numbers and assuming rationality of individuals is a cornerstone of liberal democratic thought. Being neutral is a comfortable place for academics, but to me, the efficiency critique, and that's kind of how I'll talk about the economic critiques, though informative, miss much about what's important about the policies we design. Just figuring out whether it's going to increase economics or redistribute in a certain way does not get at what we're discussing about when we're discussing art and whether to support it or not. Tax policy scholars, before they focused on efficiency, also focused on what I call equity. Is it fair? Is our tax policy carving up the burden fairly? I don't think that really gets at what we're doing when we're deciding to support art or not either. You really need a political justice determination to discuss this. And I think tax immediately gets into these things before we begin to know what we're doing. We think of it neutrally because we think it's just this thing that's raising money neutrally, but it does so much more when we tax and when we don't tax and when we allow deductions or not. To me, we need to also discuss who gets to decide what it is we're going to do. And Kant's antinomy of taste kind of explains why efficiency and equity can't settle this decision. Market failure critique, which will be at the heart, and we'll talk about that more, I'll discuss what that is, only works if you can identify a benefit that flows to everyone. But if art is ultimately taste, who decides which art produces a benefit? You're back into the antinomy. All right, so how does art policy work in the US? This is very simplistic. I'm using the NEA here. NEA budget in 2024 was $207 million. It's sometimes been more than that, but generally it has not been a whole hell of a lot. There are a few other federal agencies that actually spend money, museums and NIH. There's some different places where you can get money for art, but I think of NEA as the primary place. The charitable contribution deduction. So this is the Internal Revenue Code, when you pay your taxes every April 15th, allows a deduction for charitable contributions. And assuming you believe that that deduction is not something that would be part of a normal income tax, which is to say, in a way, that contributions to charitable organizations are so very specific, they're a matter of taste, if you will, that it's consumption that you ought to pay tax on. Lots of theory to get there, but it's consumption. If we allow a deduction, which we do, for contributions to these nonprofit arts organizations, we're essentially running a matching program where, depending on what your tax rate is, you get more money from the federal government for your project than others. So somebody in a 40% bracket, the highest income bracket, gets 40 cents on the dollar and somebody in a 20% rate would get 20% on the 20 cents on the dollar. Someone who is poor gets 0. Most people get 0 cents on the dollar. Only about 9% of the public actually is able to take the charitable contribution deduction. I'm going to stay with my time here. And it goes in such greater value that, and these are numbers I have kind of come together with a rough estimate based on Giving USA data that estimates that contributions to charitable organizations that support the arts are about 3 to 5% of dollars contributed to the arts every year. And that's been solid for past 50 years or so, since Giving USA has been collecting that data. The Joint Committee on Taxation determines how much in dollars are spent by the federal government by allowing a charitable contribution deduction. This is about 3 to 5% of the total dollars spent by the US on the charitable contribution deduction every year. So it's matching Giving USA data with Joint Committee on Taxation data to come up with, we spend about 2 to 3.5 billion annually to support, or in 2024. So 10 times as much came through this system, and over 90% of those deductions went to taxpayers earning more than $200,000. 65% went to those earning over $1 million a year. If we actually looked at that, the quantity of that 2 to 3.535, it's probably about 99% to people making over $1 million, just in terms of the actual raw numbers of where the money is coming from. So we're basically running, if you accept my premise, a plutocracy of art. We're allowing wealthy to basically decide what our US arts policy is going to look like across the country. It almost exclusively benefits the wealthy. All right. So, arts nonprofit sector. There's about, there were 95,000 arts organizations. I think this was around 2016. I forget if that was 2016 or 2013. I actually used AI to let me pull this together. So I didn't go back to, and I was just reading my numbers. So anyway, this is a rough estimate. I think there were more recently maybe 105,000, but data in this area, by the way, are difficult to cobble together. The Form 990 that tax-exempt nonprofit organizations file is not filed by everyone, so it's around 30,000 of those 100,000 arts organizations are actually filing a 990. So there's a lot of data that we're not grabbing up. It's not uniform in terms of the way that data is run. So it's not the data-rich place that you would think it would be with Form 990s available. And there's different things that we cobble together to get this information together. I relied on a variety of sources, and the years don't always match up in the way that you'd like them to. So I've tried to put together something that cobbles this together, but the data is what it is. Financial reality. One group estimates that on average, arts nonprofits, again, we're talking about charitable organizations. These are organizations that are formed primarily as nonprofit corporations. They have a non-distribution constraint. You can't distribute your earnings to your shareholders like you can with a for-profit corporation. It's got to be run for a particular charitable purpose, and many in the nonprofit community know these aspects, I think. They generate about 60% from earned revenue, 30% from contributions, and about 10% from government. That's going to be different depending on whether you're museum sector, performing arts sector, and so on, but this is a rough kind of conception. The fundamental aspect of seeing this is a reality that these organizations, for the most part, need the charitable contribution, or need contributions to exist. And the charitable contribution deduction, thus, is an incentive to people to give. So for them to exist at the level that they do today, which is not as robust as I would like for sure, and I think many in the arts would like to see them more robust, they need that charitable contribution deduction. And they need the government too, to make it. It's an aspect of arts nonprofits that they need these things. The sector is dominated by a few very large, very wealthy institutions. You've got your Met here, MoMA, you've got Lincoln Center. So New York probably has some of the largest groups of very large nonprofits. But it's also got a lot of small ones, just like a lot of urban centers around the US. They do tend to be more available in urban environments over rural. So if there is an issue in terms of the way they're distributed, and I didn't get into this aspect in the article, but there definitely tends to be wealth in the urban centers and kind of a dearth of these things. And that's been consistent. Just in the same way, hospitals. There are not hospitals, rural hospitals that we need. This picture is in the Carnegie Museum of Fine Art in Pittsburgh. That's my wife and I. That is Darren, I forget it's a mirrored object in, and I forget this artist, I forget his name. I was looking at it just yesterday, I cannot remember his name. But anyway, it's a piece I really like in the Carnegie Museum. And then that's a Keith Haring in the far back there as well, that they have there. So, tax benefits involved. And I'm keeping this relatively simple. There's two key subsidies that come from one of these arts nonprofits qualifying as tax exempt because they're described in section 501c3 of the code. That fulfills an educational purpose. They meet what's known as the operational test. They are exclusively operated for furthering an educational purpose. Almost all arts nonprofits further an educational purpose, and some have written that we should bring some new purpose, and I actually decided in doing this work that the educational purpose fits just fine in the arts, and frankly, the way arts operate, they're highly educational in my mind. Two key subsidies. Tax exemption. Tax exemption means that the organization doesn't have to pay tax on their earnings. This is not very valuable to most arts nonprofits. They are not profitable, right? We already discussed that they need charitable contributions in order to make it in the first place. So they're mostly they're spending everything they earn for the most part. There are probably a few out there that are particularly wealthy. If you're looking at like the Getty, which has $11 billion in endowment, they're all right and could pay tax on their investment earnings. But the vast majority of these organizations are not generating much of a subsidy from the fact that they don't have to pay the corporate income tax. It just doesn't do much for them. The charitable contribution deduction is where most of the action is. Donors deduct gifts from taxable income. So if we're in the 40% bracket and I make $1 million contribution, and I earned $1 million that year, instead of paying tax on that $1 million of $400,000, the government says, it's fine, you made that contribution to that charitable organization, we will excuse your obligation. And I think of that, and most tax policy scholars think of this as the equivalent of a government pay program, right? And we'll get to that in a minute, but it's kind of an upside down subsidy, right? It's like running a HUD office where you give a lot of money to very wealthy people to buy houses and nothing, well, a lot less to those who are in the middle class and nothing at all to the poor. That's how this thing works. There are people, and I have friends who make this contention, that making a contribution to an organization that has a public purpose is not your own personal consumption, and therefore you really don't have that income during that year. You've given that away and you're not experiencing it. Most tax policy scholars disagree with that But I just want to flag that. It is possible to take the position that this is not a payment program. Joint Committee on Taxation doesn't treat it that way. Supreme Court hasn't treated it that way. We have broadly, as a culture, thought of this as individual consumption, but that we value in some important way and want to encourage. All right. 9 to 10% of taxpayers, though, with the way things have been run, particularly after the 2017 Tax Act when President Trump came in, and then solidifying it with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA is what I understand people in DC are calling it. It has made it very difficult. Now, I will just highlight one thing. Congress just changed the law in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act to allow a $1,000 deduction per individual. So they have modestly changed that upside down subsidy nature of this, such that you're going to see more individuals deducting things. There are some technical problems with it that I don't like, but I do like it. I think it's moving us in a direction that I'm suggesting in this paper, that it should be more democratically oriented. It's still got the upside down aspect that's problematic, which is that you get a return based on what your rate is. So people who earn 40 are paying at a 40% rate get more than somebody paying at a 20% rate. There's one other aspect of this. If you are very wealthy and happen to have stocks, let's say you're like Elon Musk, and you founded your own company, so you have almost no basis. You paid almost nothing for your stock. So every bit of your stock is income that you would pay tax on. He can donate his stock and get a full write-off without recognizing the gain at all and deduct that against his personal income. And that is a really significant benefit that goes to the wealthy that kind of is sometimes called a double incentive for appreciated art. One other thing to flag, private foundation museums are out there. I think they are a unique problem. I tend not to talk about them too much, but one of the problems that the private foundation museums raise, there are museums started up by very wealthy people that are right next door to their home, that are almost never open. Like public access is almost nil. And there's a question of whether there's more public benefit to them. I think it's a significant problem and something that we should do more to define, that public access is key. So if there's any part of this, public access and availability is a key function. Without it, I think the deduction is really problematic. All right. Dorothea Lange, love her work. My wife was a photographer early on too, and loved her stuff as well. So, traditional tax policy approaches fail, in my opinion, to really contend with what it is we're doing with the charitable contribution deduction. And as I already talked about it a little bit, so we have that already. The traditional approach of tax policy scholars going back to the early 1900s. We got our first income tax, by the way, in 1913. There's actually an income tax started up in the Civil War in 1862 because the Union had to figure out some way of paying for the war. But that fades away in 1874. They just let it go away. And they go back to taxing based on tariffs. Populists try and bring it back in 1894 because they're ticked off, kind of like we are now, about exorbitant wealth running the country. And they're paying tariffs, so the farmers are feeling really abused by these trusts. They pass a tax in 1894, but the Supreme Court strikes it down. A movement is started, and it doesn't come back until 1913 when we pass the constitutional amendment in 1913. It's the 16th Amendment. It's my favorite amendment to the Constitution for what it's worth. My children know this. And actually all my students do, because I usually test it for federal income tax. Equity suggests all taxpayers should be treated alike, or at least is the distribution of the burden a fair one. The reason the code is structured in the way it is because we base it on an ability to pay. The burden should be borne more by people who have more ability to bear that burden. So that is noble in its equity sense. But if you give out benefits that way, you completely reverse that conception. So that burden that's borne fairly correctly, in its reverse, is done exactly the opposite of what you would expect it to be. And that upside down subsidy has long been critiqued by tax policy scholars as unfair from a pure resource standpoint. And I essentially agreed with that. Some justifications have been that we need to have these things, and they're doing things that would otherwise be done by the government, and money is going to the poor. But the reality here in the art space, it's not going to the poor. This is mostly consumed. It tends to be consumed by a white and a wealthy audience. Just a reality. And that has increased, if anything, not decreased over time. So there's very little redistribution going on within the charitable arts nonprofit space. So you can critique it from that perspective. The efficiency critique takes as its measure what would a free market do? That's essentially the question you ask. What would supply and demand be doing? If supply and demand is working just fine and there aren't any problems with the market, there's perfect information, we shouldn't mess with it. So we don't want to have anybody going in there and messing around with these types of things. But if there's a market failures are things like monopoly, public goods. What's a public good? A public good is the type of thing that once one person provides it, everybody has access to it. So typical things are the military. Once we have a military, we all have access to it. Police. It's an odd one to use, I know, and we might want to share in how it's controlled more than we apparently have right now. But clean air, clean water could be seen as a public good as well. And there's a number of other places. Asymmetrical information is a place where we tend to describe that as a market failure as well. This is like when you go to the doctor, you have no idea the medical issues. They have all the information. We tend to use the market less for those types of situations, so market interventions make sense in those circumstances. Baumol and Bowen, economists, early on in the 60s, made one of the first market failure arguments for why we should have governmental support of the arts, and it was that performing arts face a real cost disease. They don't have the ability. If you're running an opera, you need all the people that are going to be in that. You can't use tech to change the way that you provide the opera. And so they're not able to reduce cost over time. And over time, performing arts organizations in particular will need governmental support or some way of putting things together because they just long-term will not be able to provide these services. There are a variety of public goods arguments that are made within the art space for why we should have governmental support of the arts. Those can be art preserves cultural heritage. It generates positive externalities. It's good for tourism, right? These are common arguments that you'll see made within the arts sector. They develop human capital. There's one really fascinating one to me. I don't know how many of you know it, but the CIA was deeply involved in developing artists like Jackson Pollock. They actually ran a program to buy up work by, I think it was Pollock and Johns and others, and really created that market. It was a nation-building kind of conception about who we were in the US. So we have had spaces where kind of national prestige, people in the US might like feeling that they have really amazing art. That might redound to everyone in a public good sense that we're better than everybody else because of our art. I think France thinks of itself in that kind of way. If you go to France, every little city has a museum where the Louvre shares its incredible treasure trove from ill-gotten gains over the centuries that it's taken from other parts of the world. But these are public good arguments that are made. Same with Britain, the British Museum. These are kind of the conceptions. Even if a market failure exists, though, the deduction, as it's done, channels the solution through wealthy individual preferences. And there's no reason to believe that the wealthy somehow have some capability of making these decisions for us that's actually going to solve any of the market failures we're talking about. It's illogical. It makes literally no sense. That's a fundamental part for me of this article, is that the arguments we're making for this are nonsense, for why this is some way of accomplishing this result. We go to about 150, is that right? So, okay. All right. There are some arguments. So Ronald Dworkin, law professor, philosopher, has made an argument for why the arts are really important, although I think he's thinking about the fine arts in particular. He suggests that there is an interest in developing the fine arts because it redounds to us all. Popular culture ends up using these things. It's kind of like language, in the same way that English language is a part of each of our heritage in its own way. The arts develop a rich kind of conception of who we are. They tell our stories in the same way that I was talking about through the slides I was showing earlier here. The problem is he made a critique of himself in the article that he writes about it that I think was as trenchant regarding his argument as it was regarding the others, which is that the benefits are speculative. I really cannot value what they are. Like, I can go in regarding a road and I can tell everybody what they're getting from this. I cannot do that with the arts in the same kind of way. No matter how much economic works we do in this space, and I know a lot of the economics work done, and you get $7 for every $1 invested in the arts, or whatever number you want to pull out of your hat. It's speculative. It really is. And you could spend it on sports and generate. You could spend it on Britney Spears or whoever else, Taylor Swift. Those things might bring, now that fits into the arts as well. And the other problem is there's a time lag, which is that it's not the current taxpayers who are getting it, it's people in the future. So there's a real problem with that. Neither, though, asks who should decide which art gets public support. And for me, that's a fundamental aspect. Why would we decide that wealthy individuals' art is a better choice than anybody else? That's a fundamental question of political justice, not economics, and not how we distribute resources. That's a matter of how it is that we go about making collective decisions. So what is political justice? And this has kind of been my work since about 2015, a little bit before that. I look at our law. I look at what we profess to believe in the United States, the Western world, and quite a bit of the world. We profess to believe that democracy is the only just way of deciding collective decisions. Every freaking where that you look, we don't. We give it to wealthy individuals for the most part. We run decisions based on market decisions in a liberal economic order. By deciding that the state should be neutral to everything, they give away everything to being decided on the basis of wealthy decisions. For me, a core principle, though, is political justice, is democracy, which is that collective decisions should reflect somehow equal voice of all. Once we're beyond a group of this size, that's hard to do, but there are ways of making that more functional than what we do currently. And we have representation. Those are perfectly fine things. They get us closer to democracy. But the charitable contribution deduction is not accomplishing democracy at all, and I believe it is carrying out collective decision making. And our justification for running this program is in part, well, the government would otherwise be doing this. So, fundamental choice in organizing the political community, we could run it through anarchy. No one decides. Guardianship, a small elite decides. I think that's essentially what we have chosen by default, is that we keep on pushing policy into a small elite, and the small elite we've chosen are wealthy individuals. We replicate this in the way we run our political campaign system. We allow wealthy individuals to dominate how that system is operated, both the messages that we hear, and that's replicated here. And I think art actually is kind of the same thing over again in a much more subtle way, which is that we're saying that the wealthy elite know what to pick for us. And it might not be written that way, but in your day-to-day life, that is your lived experience in the way that we choose to conduct arts policy. So I have a bit about liberal democratic state. I'm not a fan of liberal democratic philosophy. So this is Rawls, this is Dworkin, Dahl to a certain extent. I tend to be more of a deliberative democracy guy. I like Habermas. I don't know how many of you have read. Jürgen Habermas, still alive. He's like 100 years old, just wrote a book the other year. He was part of an early German school and somewhat coming out of communism, or Marxism is the better way to say it, but developed deliberative democracy, kind of the father of deliberative democracy. It's thinking about ways of making decisions where people are more involved, both in developing information and coming to decisions, allowing us to have conversations to develop those things. But the liberal democratic constraint is that the neutrality principle governs. The state ought not be making decisions about what the good life is. So the state, generally in a liberal democratic conception, shouldn't be providing art in the first place. It has no business doing that because that's telling you how you ought to live your life. And it shouldn't do that. But we run a program that actually contradicts this conception. And I think we haven't come to terms with operating a liberal democratic state and including a neutrality principle. It completely fails. Let me get a couple more things in here because we're almost at the end and I want to finish up. I'll finish up by 1:55. So I'm going a little bit longer than. So Plato, art corrupts. Banish the artist. I think this is not that far from the belief some have. In an authoritarian state, that's kind of where we're moving to. And there's a lot of aspects of Plato that I think exist in current US, long-term US. Puritans, I think, have some of that aspect. Kant and Arendt said that Arendt comes and interprets Kant's antinomy in his book on Critique of Judgment, which was about aesthetics. It develops an enlarged mind, a precondition for democratic reasoning, that this allows us to see through others' eyes. I rely a lot on John Dewey. John Dewey wrote a book called Art as Experience, and it's a fabulous book. Dewey believed deeply in many ways in democracy and the capacity for us to have deliberation with one another, and he believed of art the only media of complete and unhindered communication between man and man. It allows us really to see through others, and it's a critical, fundamental experience of humans, and he saw that putting things in museums really messed us up in terms of our relationship to what art was. One more piece here. Pierre Bourdieu, French sociologist, kind of father of sociology, wrote a book called A Matter of Taste, and it's so disturbing because basically it says art is just a matter of taste, and it literally is used to divide our classes. And if we look at the way we have run our arts policy, it just confirms Bourdieu. I have trouble going with the Deweyan conception. Upside down subsidy falls on equity, fails on equity, efficiency fails there too. I think it fails on the charitable contribution deduction. So not only are we failing to actually solve the market failure, I don't think any of the critiques work in solving this problem. I think we also fail on political justice because we're giving these policies to others to decide. I love the arts, as you can see from the beginning. I don't want to see it go away, and I don't want to see the charitable contribution go away. But I can't solve this thing. I mean, like, to me, when I actually look at it, I cannot justify. The only way I could really justify is a much larger NEA and a charitable contribution deduction that's somehow tied to more collective decision making. That's the only way I can get there. I don't see a universe where we move towards that right now. I tried initial things, and these totally failed as solutions early on. Well, we could force the nonprofits to have a community board, and we could force them to write a report talking about what communities they're serving. And everybody's like, you just indicted the whole thing. How is that a solution? I'm like, I guess it's not. So I'm trying a new one, which is at least making the freaking charitable contribution deduction a credit instead, so everyone would get 20 cents on the dollar. So everybody had an equal kind of stake, at least in this thing. That would make it a bit more justifiable. But it's still problematic. That's kind of the reform slide. I will stop there.
So I'll head over here just to use the microphone, but I'll pose just a quick question or two to Phil to get things going. If you're online, please get your questions, comments ready, as well as if you're in person, please do the same. And we'll open it up for general Q&A in just a few minutes. Phil, you had a really interesting remark early on about what is art. And I was wondering, maybe this is getting too into the weeds here potentially, but for tax purposes, how is art understood or recognized? How does the tax code define art?
So number one, the tax code does not define art. But the IRS has to make decisions about whether arts organizations make it or not. And I thought about this one before. The IRS has some interesting things in there. Like in one, it talks about an organization doing jazz, and it was like the Americanness of this is important. So it looked at that as an important aspect of its art. But the IRS tends to stay away from making a conclusion as to whether something is art. It's kind of like religion. The IRS has it has a definition of church, but it does not get into the question of whether something is a religion or not. The Church of Satan is an exempt organization, for instance, just to kind of get that. And there's another church that is essentially atheists that is also a religion. And I think it thinks of art in that same kind of way. This is not to say for policy purposes that it's not worth having this conversation. So for me, having a definition of art matters, so that we can actually have a conversation about what this thing is. And you saw already that first art piece, the Brancusi piece, Bird in Flight, that was a tax case as well. Again, see, we've been long giving tax benefits to something that is art. So we have to define what this thing is. Then they came up with an aesthetically pleasing. I talk a little bit in there about copyright. So we have definitions for copyright. Is it transformative? Have we taken it? It's all kind of functional based in terms of what this thing is serving, which is why I think it's important to have the conversation about what it does, because what it does can have a conversation about what it is that we can serve, which gets back to that institutional definition. But the IRS eschews trying to define it, because it's not, I mean, like, they don't have the capacity to do that. They don't have the competency.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the potentiality of, say, political art of some kind. The administration or a administration preferentially saying this body of art, because it addresses a cultural issue that is against public policy,
Yep.
Is the state in a position to say, well, this is not art. That's art over there, but this is something different, and they can.
Great question, and I spent some time going down that path early on, right? So if you go back to when I'm growing up, Mapplethorpe and others, there are these controversies that the NEA, Jesse Helms, senator from South Carolina, long just going after the NEA for making these, so like Mapplethorpe does the Piss Christ. And it's just Serrano's Piss Christ. Yeah, Mapplethorpe's. I know. I've got them both in my head at the same time. Thank you. I wanted Serrano, and I have them together linked in my head. So yeah, they're arguing over these things, and I mean, I guess Mapplethorpe is doing the men with AIDS, and it's intense. I mean, the photos are an intense perspective. All right, so there have been some folks within the art policy space that actually like the charitable contribution deduction and having arts nonprofits run these things in order to get away from the state clamping down on what these things are. And there is a real value to that. This is one of the values I see in arts nonprofits, is being a bulwark against a state that wants to crack down on freedom of speech and freedom of association. And I fundamentally believe that arts nonprofits do this and that they are worth saving. So that's one, I mean, that relates deeply to that democratic definition of how I think about the arts. They literally are putting out messages that people understand intuitively. It's often more sly, but we run into all sorts of problems. So one of the slides I had has an image of one of the WPA murals by Refrigio. I don't know how to pronounce his name. You might know it, Refrigio. These are murals done by a Russian immigrant, an artist, in the San Francisco post office, and they became the subject of hearings in 1953 back during the Committee on Un-American Activities. This was this real strong pushback against the WPA back in the day, as these were pushing ideas of race and labor that congressmen didn't like. So we get back into things really quick regarding what it is that how art should be defined. I don't know why we should think the wealthy would be better at that question, though. I mean, just as a fundamental matter. But there has been some evidence, right, that private foundations, older private foundations where the billionaire is gone, are actually fairly defending of those things. But I don't know that we have any reason to believe that will remain in some way.
It occurs to me as well, if we think from a historical perspective, I think of who's funded the arts throughout history, going back hundreds, maybe thousands of years. You imagine the sort of wealthy, land-owning elite, the aristocracies have generally been disproportionately funding the arts, patronizing the arts.
Yeah.
I guess the US example is sort of a continuation in a different form.
I think of it absolutely the same. We are running a patronage system, and the state supports a patronage system just like we, I mean, I don't know if the state kind of supported that. In a sense it did, because many of the elites were part of the government, so they're getting money in effect from running these things. So I think of ourselves as effectively running that same kind of patronage system that we always have.
And I think maybe my last comment / question here before we open for Q&A is to reflect a little bit on my own town in Beacon, New York, where we have Dia Beacon, a very successful, popular museum. And folks who have lived in Beacon for a while will tell you that before that opened, Beacon was in very difficult times, financially and culturally in many different ways, and struggling. And then this Dia Beacon opened up, and artists moved into Beacon and bought homes, and fast forward 10, 15, 20 years, and the town is very prosperous, very, very culturally vibrant, and has really turned around. And I'm also reminded of, from time to time, when politicians wish to give tax breaks to companies to set up businesses and things in different localities. And that's, again, public money going to supporting these enterprises under a presumption that this will bring in some kind of a public benefit. That people like me, or maybe not me, but other people who just live around some of these areas will indirectly benefit from, the buildings are no longer boarded up, the streets are safer, that there are these sort of third, fourth, fifth order effects that art brings to communities. And if one could argue philanthropists who are billionaires are willing to support these public goods, and so I don't have to, or ordinary people don't have to support that, maybe that's okay. But you're kind of wrestling with, well, maybe that's not okay. Is there any argument there to be made about that there is a public good, and if the billionaire class is going to pay for it, all the better that other people then don't have to pay for it. But so what do you make of those kinds of arguments for like art as a public good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In those instances, art is never really a public good, right? It's individual to those individual places, and as soon as the break goes away, it's gone. But I have watched it. I mean, like I showed you George Marxe in Arnaudville, Louisiana. Arnaudville is a one stoplight town. He's really transformed that community in significant, important ways. But it's largely not from wealthy contributions. It's a lot more governmental involvement and collective involvement to make that kind of thing happen. Now, a stronger argument in those with the tax breaks, and it can connect to the charitable contribution potentially, is that we've made a collective decision that we want to further our policy in this way. I still think it's fundamentally incoherent, and right, it's not a public good, I would say, because it's limited to Beacon, New York. Like those things don't go beyond that. It's not something that's redounding across the country. Not every city. Some other cities are losing out because they don't have that. So not everybody is getting a value from Beacon, New York in that same kind of way. I see it in Pittsburgh too. I mean, I can bring that up again. Like Pittsburgh is a city that is not down in the complete dumps today after the crash of steel, largely because Carnegie, Frick, and others left sizable amount of money, Heinz as well, into that community, and it has assets that it wouldn't have otherwise, and it's a richer place because of it. It's part of the reason that I'm addicted to it, right? I love these things. I love being in Pittsburgh with all of these assets. I love coming to New York. I could have put up an image of the JP Morgan library. It's exquisite. I love coming to New York to go into this place. But I don't see it as democratic. I see it as being addicted to wealth. And I think we need to come to terms with our kind of hagiography of wealth as a solution to all our problems. I think we need to have a deeper conversation and see our own ability to solve problems ourselves rather than relying on some saint who's wealthy coming to town and solving all our problems. They can't. We can.
In philanthropy, those involved in fundraising will tell you there's been a trend. Donors down, dollars up. Fewer people are giving more,
Yep.
especially among some of the billionaires, like Mackenzie Scott. The changes in philanthropy may, in the future, in time, really shift what the nonprofit sector looks like and what art looks like and what does receive support and what doesn't. So there's a lot of interesting power being consolidated in interesting areas of life, like in the arts, that probably does warrant some more attention. Okay, so I've been talking long enough. I think it's time to hear from some of our audience members. We can start with folks who are in the room. I don't know, do we have a mic to pass around? Or if not, maybe I'll just ask Phil to kind of restate the question.
Yeah, I'm glad to restate the question.
For folks online. Oh, here we have a microphone. Great, thanks.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Seems quiet. I'll try to speak loudly.
Oh, I can hear it. That's
okay,
good.
great. So
So I have sort of two questions, one, but they are related, and one is maybe leads into the other. So the first is this question of the share of people taking the charitable contribution with incomes over $200,000 and then over $1 million. Is that specific to the arts, or is that true of the charitable contribution overall? Okay, similar to the charitable okay, so that isn't unique. So which is leading into my second question is are there other tax policies with similar critiques? Because I do think in cultural policy in general, we struggle to actually make any progress. This is going to sound no one cares about the arts in the same way as creating sort of cross-sector alliances. So if this is true of nonprofits or the charitable contribution as a whole, it sounds like maybe there's some room to think outside of the arts to specific arts question. Anyway, you answered my question, but I'm curious what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it is across the policies run throughout. So one of the common ones is we have the mortgage interest deduction. So if you buy a house, you're able to deduct the interest you pay on your loan. If you're poor, you don't buy a house. If you're wealthy, you buy a house. The deduction almost entirely goes to people who are pretty well off. And Congress limited it to a certain extent, but it still is this deduction that's insane. We're running a HUD for wealthy people. We literally, and we probably spend more through that contribution deduction, through the home mortgage interest deduction than we do through HUD. And they don't have to go through any policy to get there. Nothing. They just take it every year without anybody examining whether they actually deserve it any kind of way or not, or they bought lobster that year, right? If you get into those politics of embarrassment regarding people who are poor, none of those arguments come up into that space. Healthcare. We give a deduction for the healthcare that you buy or that you get. It's excluded from your income if your employer buys it. If you work for a big employer, you're getting an enormous break every year. It's the largest amount of money that we spend, and yet we cannot do universal health care because these people don't deserve it. Don't get me started. It's over $200 billion a year that we're spending in the healthcare deduction, exclusion. And we cannot provide healthcare to people who are poor. We can do Medicaid, but in the middle, all we can do is the Obamacare, and we can't even come up with the money for the subsidies. But anyway, so yes, there are places across the tax code, and people who write in tax like myself, we get very interested and excited about our stuff, and it matters a whole hell of a lot. I highly encourage it as a specialty if you ever go to one.
Questions, comments? Anyone else?
There's two questions in the chat.
Me.
One question from Deborah Smith is, how about the argument that art is neither a public good or a private good, but a merit good?
Yeah, so in economics, there are those who make the argument, and I kind of accept along the lines of the merit good, kind of from the same conception, Deborah, or Deb, that I see the merit good argument as kind of the same as the public good argument. I don't see them as different. The idea is this. University is something that should be valued outside the market. Art is something that should be valued outside the market. The market, indeed, doesn't have the ability to measure those things, and if we sit around and base all our judgments of value based on how the market values things, we're precisely measuring everything wrong. Like, the market is not a moral judgment mechanism, but we're using it as a moral judgment mechanism. So I talk a little bit about the merit good issue. I think I had more in the paper before. I kind of had, when I got into this paper, it became huge. I got a lot into the definition of art. I started reading all sorts of aesthetics, philosophy, and so on, and I had to bring this in for a landing. I have thought about going down those arguments more, and I think they're actually important, particularly the conception that essentially our tax code is operating all its benefits of a market mechanism, and they're just wrong. There's no morality there. There's no justness within that system. And I think the merit good argument still does not justify allowing wealthy individuals to be making the decision of what merits something that's good. That has not been a functional way of accomplishing that goal in any kind of way. I think we have to have deeper arguments and discussions about how we would go about supporting these things. I think my main answer is we need a lot more conversation and a lot more development of our capability to collectively decide together. We have lost those capacities, and we need to build that again some way. And I think we can start doing that by acknowledging where we are failing in very significant ways, and I think we do in delivering collective goods through the code.
Let's get a couple follow-ups.
Hi. Oh, can you hear me? Thank you so much for this presentation. I've been an arts administrator for 10 years, and for 4 years I've been a union representative as well, so I really appreciate your remarks on collective decision-making. I have two questions, if I can remember them both. The first one is coming out of undergrad, where I went to a small liberal arts college, and coming into an arts nonprofit space. I guess experienced two institutions that were both not paying for income, for tax, but had very different financial situations. And I know a few years ago in the state legislature, some elected officials were trying to pass legislation to have NYU and Columbia pay taxes to help raise funding for CUNY and public schools. And this, to my understanding, this was somewhat of like a novel approach, and I guess I'll just wrap my two questions together. I'm curious what your thoughts are. I see you have reforms about federal policy. I'm wondering what state and local policy can do to maybe like amend some of these issues. And as right now we're in the state budget process in New York, and we have this big Tax the Rich campaign that is not focused on arts nonprofits, but many other things. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so first, I live this issue of nonprofits not paying tax, particularly the very wealthy ones. So we, in Pittsburgh, have a similar situation to New York, right? NYU and Columbia own probably most of Manhattan, or the largest share of Manhattan of anyone. And our tax laws at the federal level push them towards having an interest in doing that, because the businesses that they can go into include real estate and not having to pay tax on real estate. So it's a particularly useful place for them to go. A lot of urban centers, Boston has been the most progressive on this front, have developed what are known as pilots, payment in lieu of taxation. I think they get the most, and I think it's around $30 million a year from Harvard, MIT, and others. We're still not talking about a whole hell of a lot. But I think about it very trenchant, because UPMC owns a huge swath of Pittsburgh and doesn't pay any tax. And they bring a lot of people into the Pittsburgh area. And those individuals have to pay a lot higher tax, because it's over 34% of the property in Pittsburgh is not taxable. It's a problem for a community. by them not paying money, they cause everybody else to have to pay more. And they've also got an interest in grabbing up the tax base. So if the tax base is shrunk, that means everybody has to pay more. And that's everybody that's making money. And in that case, you're talking about UPMC, which is one of the most active businesses in the area not paying money. It's a significant problem. There have been lots of different solutions, including, so like we got a new mayor. The previous mayor was trying to sue these organizations and arguing you're not really a charity. And some of these properties you should be paying tax on. They were not very successful on this. The courts tend to go against this notion. I think we need to come to terms on that because our urban centers are housing a lot of the nonprofit space and not generating the tax dollars from those spaces. And I think it's having negative impacts on those communities, which is you're hollowing out a lot of the tax base and causing everybody else to want to move out because you don't have the ability to live in those spaces as those prices go up. In terms of state governments, I've watched Louisiana and I have a deep love-hate relationship with the state in which I grew up. It was a racist, misogynist place. My mother couldn't own property when I'm born in 1970. Her husband, my father, was the one who could sign off on things. This is frickin' 1970. It's just stunning to me. And, Civil Rights Act occurs just a few years before that. And I'm being told that we're no longer operating a Jim Crow system anymore. And, after you grow up, you realize that wasn't really true. Never really changed all that fundamentally. It changed in really important ways. But I've watched really fabulous arts organizations. And I think it goes back to the fundamental part that I was talking about, which is small communities can demand that they want things, that they are important to them, that their voice matters in terms of these things. Talking to people and engaging with the community about why art matters and why people's voice in that discussion matters. Getting people to see those productions matters. Getting schools to see those things matters. They learn about themselves, they learn about the community, we learn about each other. And so I would say it's a really rich conversation to be having and to demand a voice about. Thank you for the question.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. Wasn't entirely sure what to expect coming in, but have been very convinced by the flaws in the charitable contribution deduction. I'm a bit curious about how close very wealthy individuals are to maxing out this exemption, because I'm wondering if there's any benefit to having a direct relationship between like the very wealthy and then arts organizations, like presumably ones that aren't just, a museum that's often close to the public and basically their backyard. And I wonder I'm just curious if fostering that relationship without I guess in the absence of this deduction, I'm picturing more of the government just collecting that tax and then redistributing it to arts organizations. I'm wondering if having that direct relationship without the government as a third party would encourage wealthy individuals to donate more past just what the deduction might be?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that's kind of the heart of the challenge. I like the rich art environment I have in Pittsburgh. And that rich art environment exists in part because the Mellon family, Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury back in 1920. But he had made a ton of money because of Carnegie Steel and other operations there in Pittsburgh. He had bought up the Hermitage Museum, a lot of art from Russia as that government collapsed. Some of that, a small part of that might be in Pittsburgh. A lot of that became the east wing of the Smithsonian Museum of Art. And that's exceptional. And, you know, he does that with a bit of push from Roosevelt, that they actually have the IRS go and sue Mellon for tax fraud back in the 30s. I mean, Roosevelt is using the IRS in ways that we now think of as very problematic to get this. So for me, the question that you're asking me is, aren't we a lot poorer culturally without it? And I don't know if I have the answer. I think it's in part true, but I think we need to start trying to figure out what it looks like when we share decision making and see if we can get to another place where we don't rely on them so much. But it's scary. I mean, I think there's a vulnerability in attacking this that I feel, and that's laid bare in your question. And I don't know what the answer is. I think we need I think there's a lot of conversation, but some empirical information in terms of what it's done. And I don't think that we have that information.
I know we have time constraints right now, but I would be really curious if you could speak a little about the credit program that you were proposing in the military.
Yeah, no, I'd be glad to. So, people have proposed this for a long time. And in fact, we use credits already in the tax code. If anybody's used the American Opportunity Credit or the Hope Credit, do y'all know what that is? So in your first 4 years of college, and this is one that I always tell my students, the reason they should take federal income tax is because I'm going to save them money. There's an American Opportunity Credit in your first 4 years of college education. And that credit is equal to 100% of it's a $2,500 credit. 100% of the first $2,000 you spend on college tuition. So basically, the federal government will give you $2,000 for the first $2,000 of money that you spend. 40% of that's refundable. Usually that's gotten by your parents. Your parents are getting that credit. The next, there's 25% credit on the next $2,000. Everybody gets the same amount. This was a middle-class oriented tax credit focused on ensuring that middle-class individuals were able to send their kids to college. Came under Clinton originally. It was increased a little bit during Obama. So the idea of a credit is, yes, we should be bearing the burden of tax from an ability to pay, so we should have a progressive income tax. It goes up the more money you make. That's a fair way of sharing the burden. Most people, like if you go and ask people how burdens should be borne, they unanimously agree about this. But if we build a deduction system based on that and benefit system based on that, you're doing it in the reverse order, right? Credit allows everybody to get the same dollars from those amounts. So in other words, if we made it a 20% tax credit, if I gave $100, the government would be pitching in $20. So in other words, I'd get a $20 tax credit and I wouldn't have to pay $20. It would take $20 off my taxes and it would take $20 off of for their first $100. Now, you'd still get a whole lot more from people who are billionaires because billionaires are donating $1 million. So if we ran a 20% tax credit, that would mean they would get a $200,000 off their taxes. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Basically, the idea is instead of being a deduction where it comes based on the taxes that you're paying, a 40% marginal tax rate, you get your deduction based on the highest tax rate. Everybody just gets the same percentage, essentially, is the way it works. It's easier to show you if we actually take, it's easier to understand once you set it down.
Thank you for explaining.
But thank you for the question, too.
We have about maybe 5 minutes, time for at least one more question. Is there any in the room or?
There's one more in the chat.
Microphone?
Simon says, you brushed by the tax exemption, but I want to hear a little more about what you think about it, especially where the wealthiest institutions own significant land and operations that go untaxed. You touched on this a little bit in another question, but he's curious how it applies to arts nonprofits.
Yeah, fair question. So tax exemption is where I've written quite a lot and thought about a lot. My first article is what we talk about when we talk about tax exemption, because I was a big Raymond Carver fan back in the day, and so I didn't realize that's a common title. Everybody picks that one for some reason. They like that. Raymond Carver has a short stories, what we talk about when we talk about love. One of my favorite books of short stories. Tax exemption, to me, has the same kind of problems as the charitable contribution deduction. It's less extreme in this space, largely because unlike hospitals that are actually generating dollars, many of the arts nonprofits are not. So I'm just not as troubled by tax exemption in this space. However, it does have an impact, particularly for things like private foundations and other groups that have major endowments. I am troubled by the way we tend to run our tax-exempt institutions. They tend to overwhelmingly be run by white, wealthy individuals who are on the boards of directors. They tend to be overwhelmingly male. Gender, there are real issues of representation in these groups. Essentially the same critique comes about, which is that we're operating a system that as a result, in a sense, of just operating off the market, we're reinforcing all the worst traits of what the market has been for so long. That many folks have tried to do things to change, that our federal government is pushing back against. The question raises some really interesting questions right now. There's a huge attack on nonprofit organizations. The current federal government is attacking these nonprofits that just a few years ago, after the sort of racial justice reckoning, after George Floyd and so many others, moved towards trying to have more inclusive policies. The record is that they didn't adopt that many. But we have lost at the Supreme Court in terms of students for fair admissions, in terms of college universities, and the administration is using that to claim that DEI policies, not defining them at all, but that those are counter to the law, and pushing back against those organizations for that. But the same problems are taking place there. I interestingly find it a little easier to support the art being run there from the tax-exempt angle than I do the charitable contribution deduction, largely because I think art really does support a democratic people, and having access to that art allows us to have conversations and telling those stories. But if they're not going to be representative, we're not really telling the full story. And I think we do need to come to terms with those boards and with the stories that those nonprofits are telling. And I think we're going in the wrong direction. We saw many nonprofits renege on their principles for many good reasons. I have been with folks at University of Pitt where they're like, I don't know what to do. If I leave the DEI stuff in there, my vulnerable community will no longer have the money that it has. And so they've scrubbed their websites of these types of things. I think we need to go in a very different direction. And I'm not going to critique it and say we should pay investment income. There have been places where I believe investment income should be subject to tax. And under the current structure, it probably ought to be. But it's a hard question. I don't have a final answer for you on that. I really ended up going down the charitable contribution deduction. So you're hearing kind of part of where I went into this space, and it's a real soft spot for the arts, I think. and having a hard time critiquing what I see. But I think it still needs to be critiqued here too. So great question. I've got more to thinking, and I am really open to suggestions on that. So feel free to email me, phackney@pitt.edu. I'd love to hear your comments.
Well, thank you for the excellent questions, and thank you to Phil for joining us today. I'd like to wind things down. We're already at our end time. So if you're in the room in person, please enjoy some coffee. I'll invite folks to sort of join us here at the front if you want to pepper Phil with some more questions that we didn't have time for today. And I hope everybody enjoys the lovely weather outside. And thank you for joining us. I was going to ask if we had more time about the Met. Did you see that story about the